A regenerative leader is one who understands that the key role for me is to be an ecosystem nurturer. My key role is to ensure inbuilt resiliency into my organizational design so that my organization has the needed carrying capacity to withstand all kinds of systemic shocks. And for me to do that, I need to make sure that I focus just as much on the outer elements as the inner elements, because the inner elements, the inner quality of being informs the outer. So what does that mean? That means that right now we have a global pandemic of stress and burnout. And when people are in a state of stress, they go into a high beta brainwave mode. And when they are in that mode, from an evolutionary point of view, it's genius. That's the brainwave mode that means that we're still around today. So when we face the predator on the prairie, all our energy would go into problem solving that. We would filter out everything else and we would get tunnel vision. And the problem is when we are in that state, it's physiologically impossible for us to access empathy and compassion, but also interconnected systems thinking. It's impossible to see the wholeness of the picture. We focus in on the element or just one single element. And the problem is that the majority of our executives, but also employees today, are spending too much of their time in that state. And that is something that we see in our societies right now. There is this inner stress and friction and sickness in our societies that is also infusing outer elements. I believe that when a species doesn't feel whole and feels ill and is on the verge of burnout or depression and stress, it's very difficult for that human being, for that species to be a steward of life. To be a custodian of life and to think in interconnected systems and see how my actions are actually creating ripple effects far beyond what I can imagine. So that's the inner component that is just equally important as it is for a regenerative leader to understand biomimicry, circular economy, cradle to cradle, and have that understanding that every input is creating an output. And how can I, as I said before, become a force for good? How can my company, how can my organization become this regenerative force for good, this ripple creator that is not just sustaining what we have right now, which has become the way that we have in a way made sustainability to be, that we're sustaining what we currently have and we need to move beyond that. So with a regenerative mindset, we are also regenerating and replenishing what we have destroyed on our way, especially the past 70, 80 years. So a regenerator is a custodian of life, is one who understands living systems principles, one who understands how to weave, how to co-create, how to have your ego in check. It's someone who understands how to hold safe spaces for polarities, hold space for emergence. Yeah, I'm gonna stop myself there, but there's I could go on for a long time, but that is hopefully enough of an essence of how I see a regenerative leader. I was this typical passionate, very fire-driven person who, as I said before, at a young age became aware about environmental issues and wanted to dedicate my life to address those. And I think what I have, or rather had in common with a lot of very passionate people, is this sense of obligation, the sense that the weight of the world is on my shoulders. So I need to work myself to the ground in order to make sure that I have done all I possibly could. And I actually remember in the Amazon forest, we did a lot of long hikes to destroy snipers' huts and rescue animals and all of that. And I was walking around with shamans in their kind of footsteps, trying to keep up. They are in really great health. And it was really difficult for me to keep up with them. And I developed this mantra that you are a machine, you are a machine. And that just kind of stuck with me. That how I felt was not important. It was irrelevant because I was on a mission and you're just a machine. And that became part of my whole identity. I never took breaks, really. I had to work all the time so that I could say to myself at the end of the day, or at the end of my life, that I did all I possibly could with the time that I was given. But thankfully, I had a massive disruption happening in my life almost 8 years ago, that forced me to stop me in my tracks. And it was quite a blessing that it was a brain injury. And even though I did my very best to project manage my way out of the state that I was in, I surrendered and gave up the fight and let go. And it took a long time. And the TEDx talk describes that whole process. The injury happened in July 2015, and I was very much involved in the process leading up to the COP21 in Paris. And I could not give up the thought about going to Paris. But 3 weeks before going to Paris, I finally accepted the fact that I couldn't even go to the airport. So how would I be able to go to Paris? So I booked a silence retreat, and that very much during the COP21, so that I would kind of take myself away of the FOMO, and be in a forest without mobile phone or anything, and just be in silence. And that marked a beginning of a new chapter in my life. And today I design my life around incorporating silence, incorporating time in nature, only working 25 hours a week to make sure I keep myself in balance, or else I know that fire, that Daniel and I briefly touched upon it before we welcomed everyone in, but that kind of passionate fire can have a way with us if we are not constantly kind of keeping it in check. And I have that, Daniel was calling it an inner demon, I think. And I have that as well. And it's something that I need to kind of nourish, and I have to recognize that it's there and it's part of me, but it's not getting the better of me. It's not, I'm not allowing it to burn myself to the ground because of it. So I'm trying to, because I think it's a constant kind of process of navigating that and learning how to take the potent essence of that, because we shouldn't diminish it or devalue it. We are fortunate to have that. So how can we take the essence of that and let it show to the world in a healthy way? So silence, yes, is an incredibly important part of how I live my life now. And it's in silence that I can hear the voice that is not influenced by my ego, but it feels like the wisdom of life that I can access, that we can all access. This is not something that I can do. It's something we can all access in silence. And that is where I can sink deeper into a wisdom that has nothing to do with me, but I can become a channel of it. But it takes constant practice, and it takes constant kind of messing up and falling and getting back there. But it's something that I deeply encourage all that I work with, all the executives that I work with, on creating that practice of surrendering to silence, and see what wants to emerge when we dare listen to the voice that emerges in that silence.
Well, that's right to the heart of it, isn't it? And I think that Laura's story beautifully describes actually that. Like Laura earlier said, when she was talking about letting go of her own former self through that brain injury. Well, I wrote it down. Surrendering an old identity. And this surrendering an old identity is really hard to do, because it always is bound up with years and years of hard work to build that identity through what we've done, what we've achieved, what we went through. And so we get very wedded to it. Like, I spent a fair time in academia, and like I have this deep compassion for aging professors who spent 30, 40 years building up a theory framework around them, and then they see themselves involved by it, because to let go of some of the fundamental ideas that built this edifice means letting go of 30 years of work, means saying, what have I told my students? I was wrong. And it's only very few people, whether academics or otherwise, that can question one's own pattern to the point of saying, yes, I did the best I could from the perspective I had then, but I was wrong. And I think this is what our society now needs to do so urgently and so deeply, that the biggest worry, and this is also in the conversation that Laura and I had before when we talked about the COP process, is the concern that there's so many really well-meaning people ready to let go of a little bit, thinking they're doing the work, but not willing to ask the deeper question of, wait a minute, am I still responding in the same pattern as before? And this is the pattern of problem solving at an abstract global level, and then forcing solutions onto people and places, because now we have the solution and we've got the funding, we can implement it and we can scale it up. And that's the kind of bioaccommon life is powerful question. Maybe part of the crisis is the way we're responding to the crisis. For me, that is really at the center here when we talk about letting go and hospicing the old, is how do we make sure we don't confuse the institutions with the people, or the businesses with the people, so we don't other people for having been part of destructive companies or destructive policies, but we recapture them as human beings in their full potential in the new context. And that's the midwifing. And it's not easily done. It's and that's like, I just wanted to pick up on one thing before I let Laura answer your question. That Laura said, like, what you've demonstrated in your own life story is, for me, another facet of regenerative leadership that even goes beyond the capacity of being a force for good. Like we all would like to be a force for good, and doing good is the step beyond the kind of cold neutrality of sustainability, in the sense of we're just not doing any negative impact. But for me, the regenerative leadership is exactly what you've demonstrated in your life story, which is to let go of what no longer serves, and to constantly question, am I still in alignment with life's regenerative impulse? How do I stay in that alignment? Even noticing that our own inner lion, force for good, or inner demon that wants us to act more, can, if not tempered, become part of the old. And that what we actually need to model as regenerative leaders is, like the way you're deciding to prioritize your children and your family by only working 25 hours and making space for emergence in yourself, or life emerging through you, by slowing down, because the silence you speak to is also about speed. And so this process of midwifing and hospicing is central to our culture, but it's, as Regenesis Group likes to say, these different levels of work. It happens in our personal development, so we need to let go of identities and our own storytelling of who we are and why we're important or why we're not, and discover our essence and be true to our truth in the sense of rediscovering our agency in every moment, because everything we do changes the world every day, all of us. But we've not been telling a narrative that reminds us of that. But at the same time, we need to, as teams, as businesses, as local governments, as communities, question, do we want to keep othering others? And we're in the same boat, and the boat is sinking, and we will meet a future sooner or later, depending on how privileged we are, where the only way forward is a collective collaborative path, or we will hit a dead end. And so how do we build the muscle of collaboration? How do we build the capacity of journeying forward into an unknown future, the capacity to question our own solutions that we worked so hard to propose and implement and finally get through, and say, product recall, made a mistake. That is for me regenerative leadership, and you're building that by your wonderful learning journey with so many people who have started on this journey. What you're working in that year-long program, Laura, is the capacity of these individuals to question themselves, to resource themselves in silence, in slowing down, in questioning where to put the gift of their life's energy, how to be a true activist in terms of what are they activating instead of what are they hospicing. So yeah, over to you, Laura.
But you point to something really, really interesting, Daniel, that is something that I'm pondering a lot these days. And I know you've pondered a lot on that in your remarkable life journey so far. The hospicing and the midwifing is something that is coming up in my work a lot these days. I hold space for a lot of executives in private, safe spaces, preferably in nature, where they can start to open up around that grief and sadness that they feel around having ruthlessly often walked the corporate ladder and gotten the title, gotten the power, gotten all of that they thought would make them happy and that they thought life was about, because that was the story they were told. That is what you strive for, to be a successful human being. And now so many people are starting to, I hate to use the word wake up, but so let's see if we can find another word, but they're starting to come back to center, in the sense that, what, as you were referring to, what have I done? I have dedicated, as you say, I don't meet with a lot of academics, but for business leaders, I've built my whole career around extraction and exploitation of human and natural resources. And I have to sit with that. And either I sit with that and I accept and surrender to that, and I publicly admit that that is the sadness that I'm currently navigating and dealing with, the grief, and that this is the new path that I'm heading towards. But that takes so much courage. I see it more often today than I did 3-4 years ago, and that is a good sign. But most executives decide, when they start to kind of realize that it's too uncomfortable, they would rather go back up the corporate ladder and cling on, because admitting that everything you've dedicated your life to has been leaving a trail of destruction, that takes a very courageous human being to admit that. But as I said, thankfully, more and more tapping into that courage and are starting a reconciliation process behind closed doors. It's not something that they are publicly communicating, at least not yet. But they're started with the board of directors, with the C-level suite, a process of reconciliation. What is the new evolutionary version of this entity that is starting to not leave a trail of destruction, but leave a trail of regeneration, and is starting to play an active role as custodians of life? And those are the incredibly potent, fascinating, interesting conversations that are happening in many places. I was guest teaching on John Fullerton's course last night. And he shares the exact same experience, which was very positive. He sees the same trend, that there's a reconciliation process going on behind closed doors right now among executives. I'm not saying it's happening at the speed it has to happen, but I believe in exponentials, in the sense that hopefully this is starting to gain momentum. I know that you have experienced the same, that this whole field of regeneration, I assume you must feel a sense of having been the odd one out for such a long time, and now finally suddenly people are getting what you've been trying to tell us for so long. And how do you actually feel about that, Daniel? Is that overwhelming, or is it only a good thing? Is it worrying in any way? How do you feel about this movement of regeneration finally gaining traction?
Well, in many ways, you said you don't like the word "wake up," and I don't like it either that much. And what I actually felt earlier when you were speaking as well, when we were talking about, also what Philippa was talking about, how more and more people feel this sense of never being able to arrive anywhere, because you're constantly trying to respond to so many different fronts, and you're kind of doing a bad job on each and every one of them, because they're all valuable when you look at them individually, but you simply don't have the capacity lifetime-wise, like in 24 hours, to do each of them justice, particularly in a non-hurried, spacious, timely way. And this overload, but also this slight nagging anxiety of feeling like we're looking at that sand clock and we're literally looking at the last few grains falling. And I feel like we've all talked so much about it's all fundamentally interconnected. Life is a fundamental planetary process. Even the perspective of seeing ourselves as individuals and individual species is a mental framework imposed on this larger interconnected being, which is life as a planetary process. And if that's what's emerging out of leading edge biology, evolutionary science, and physics, then maybe we're not waking up, but life is stirring through us. Like what we're experiencing in this unease is life's own unease about where life is at. And of course, where we're at, because we've driven that process so much. And so it's, for me, natural that there would be this life's regenerative impulse surging through us at this point, because it's an evolutionary pattern that is trying to protect itself. And the key important thing as we're talking about regeneration that I feel is in such urgent need to be foregrounded every time we talk about it, because otherwise we fall into the old pattern of seeing regeneration, regenerative cultures, regenerative leadership, regenerative business or economy or whatever we want to put that adjective in front as just the new adjective that is right now the one that we can sell and talk about, and we're already kind of strategically positioning ourselves. Well, what's the next one? Shall I also bet on thriving and flourishing, because maybe that will come in next? Or so maybe I'll use a dual meme in my next book to just be sure. This is the misunderstanding of regeneration just as a human concept that is coming through a few people and becoming trendy. And that would be the way of answering the question if I had any personal ego-invested ownership or whatever over my tiny contribution to this, because there have been many people who brought this awareness around regeneration into a sharper focus, and many of them for much longer than I've been working, like Kara Sanford and Regenesis Group and JT Lyle and Buckminster Fuller and Patrick Geddes and so many others. And this notion of life's regenerative impulse working through us, it was in John and Nancy Todd's New Alchemy Institute in the 60s. And so this I feel all of this is has been emerging for a long time. Yes, on a personal level, what is fascinating, like, and again, my one of really important person in my life is Professor Seton Baxter at Dundee University, who I did my PhD with, together with John Todd, was my second PhD supervisor. And what Seton Baxter taught me is the absolute, like, for me, again, leadership in a different way. Joy of planting memes or ideas and then having other people take them up to the point that they're deeply convinced that this is their idea, that they take such ownership of it. And as a mentor, Seton did this so many times with me while I was doing my work on my PhD in design for human planetary health. I would have a conversation with him, and then 3 weeks later, I would write an inspired 3 pages thinking I've just made a major contribution to original knowledge. And then I would tell Seton with excitement, and he would celebrate me. And then maybe 2 or 3 days later, I'd suddenly go, wait a minute, that's all based on the conversation I had with Seton 3 weeks ago. So I would remember, but he never said, see, I told you so, or finally you got it. And so, yeah, I'm celebrating that I hear so many memes coming out in so many different ways. And then, yeah, because ultimately, I don't think they're owned by anyone. I learned so much through my time at Schumacher College and through being mentored by people like Satish Kumar, or meeting people like James Lovelock and Stefan Harding and Brian Goodwin. And I spent 20 years on a humble apprenticeship with a lot of people that I feel I've just woven together into a larger tapestry of meaning in my work. And
that is
and
the
I'm
essence.
also, yeah.
Sorry.
So yeah, so in that sense, I feel excited that there's a large take up on all of this, but even with this truth and reconciliation process with large corporates and so on, I like coming back to this surrendering identities and how deep do we need to go, and how brutally honest, like in the truth bit, that these corporate executives have to speak to when they say, my leadership of this company has condoned or indirectly or directly exasperated degenerative patterns on life. Do we not also as a society have to stop kidding ourselves with regard to what is technologically possible? I still see ourselves so enthralled with the technological progress narrative that we really believe we can get out of this by letting the Elon Musks of this world tell us how to do it. And I feel that that's another letting go of an identity of, oh yeah, we are a technological civilization and the next stage is conquering the stars and stuff. I don't know, maybe we just need to become a deeply planetary species before we can become an interplanetary species. Because right now, the destructive small percentage of humanity that has caused this problem, because it hasn't been all of humanity, that's the other terrible thing in this narrative, that we blame all of humanity, and we blame ourselves as being somehow a cancer on the planet. That's a deeply destructive narrative. Anybody who believes that is contributing to that. It's reinforcing that. We are a regenerative species. Like yesterday, I hope to open, like we seem to be dancing in the same circles. You were with John yesterday in his leadership work. I was with John yesterday in the opening of the Bioregional Summit. And yeah, this seeing this all emerge everywhere around the world, that there are these impulses, but understanding that it's 20 past 1, not 5 to 12. There are collapses coming at us that will be hard and fast. And it is the local capacity of people in place to adapt and respond to these yet uncertain and unforeseeable disruptions. But we know they will come. We don't know how they will take shape, but we know they will come because of what we started. If we put our resources into building that scale linking, regionalized, local and bioregional structure to weather whatever storms we have summoned that are yet to come, metaphorically and literally, I think we will spend our human capacity and resources more wisely than if we try to build a large ecological civilization at the global scale. But at the same time, I know that that sounds very idealistic at a time where we have the evil specter of power blocks of China versus this versus that versus NATO versus Russia surging up again. But even there, if we lose our energy there rather than come together as people in place and in a region and start to do the face-to-face, human-to-human, human-to-soil and forest and river relationship building again, I'm not sure whether we're going to weather those storms.
Yes, there's a lot there to unpack, Daniel. And there's a lot to be deeply saddened by. And I think the way that I do my best to navigate these times is because one approach is the bioregional approach. And I completely agree with everything that you said. But it's important that we don't create this space of othering. And I believe that imaginal cells and agents of transformation and the alchemists of transformation that we need right now, they are everywhere potentially. And I see part of my work as the Trojan horse and enter the big corporate machines and tell them about the importance of soil building and building connections from soil into how we lead and how we manage, and and start a conversation there in terms of what can we learn from soil, what can we learn from permaculture, what happens when soil is really depleted and its lack of ability to capture nutrients and capture carbon, and how it becomes incredibly fragile also to navigate floods and all kinds of things, and how can we translate that into how we lead and how we build resiliency. And part of that process, I see it as a form of capacity building, because that reclaiming and reconnection with the force of life that you were talking about, because I completely agree. It's not about waking up. It's about allowing life to speak through us and becoming these vessels of transformation by surrendering to something we may not be able to completely put into words, but it's allowing a greater force to work through us. And I see that is happening on a corporate level as well. And what I hope will happen is that all of these people will have started or began a process that means that they have rekindled their love for soil and understanding how living systems work, that will enable them, hopefully, to begin this trajectory of becoming custodians of life. And why am I saying that? I'm saying that because I don't believe that the right way forward is for everyone to quit their jobs and move out into an eco community, and that is the only way forward for us to become regenerators. I believe that regenerators, they exist in all walks of life, in all sectors, in all spheres, and we need them to be everywhere. We need them to be in the UN system. We need them to be in the WEF system. We need them to be everywhere. And that doesn't mean that we should fight for those institutions to necessarily stick around, but we need them to exactly hospice and surrendering to allowing a new thing to emerge. And what you are also talking to or speaking to is that importance that it's embarking on a regenerative journey is not about teaching a new vocabulary in the sense of being a really good academic student. It's doing exactly what you have done, weaving and allowing different threads to be part of your unique tapestry of life and be part of your unique contribution to life. And I can often have the same experience that for example, all of the amazing people that are going through the journey, I have you, I have John Fullerton, John Elkington, and many others come in and talk about the same thing, but offering it with their unique voice, with their unique music. And what I see again and again is that things that I have thought that I have already kind of told them, or we have been through this already, suddenly they get it because it's communicated in a frequency or in the kind of music that they can hear, that they can absorb. So that is why we need a whole kind of army, to use a negative word, an army of musicians that can speak with their unique frequency and their unique tone of voice. And instead of going into, I think you and I have talked about this before, how can we also let go with regeneration being captured by consultants and this becoming the new thing for coaches and consultants. And today I sit with it in a warmer way than I did before, in the sense that we need that to happen. We need that to happen. Of course, it's deeply saddening if it's watered down and if it's used in a McKinsey kind of way where it's just about speaking in a trendy new language. But we need that diversity of musicians that can capture and provide the conditions for new imaginal selves to wake up in the screwy, messy face of metamorphosis that we are in collectively. You are muted.
I completely agree. And in recent developments about the last year, I've seen some of the real classical old systems players move into this space very aggressively with large foundation funding, and because there's still a lot of business people who, just because somebody has a former McKinsey background, they must be doing it the proper way. There's the beginning of a conversation about regenerative that is completely in the rabbiting the, oh yeah, it's time to do good, rather than just be neutral, and that's it. Like, basically, net positive impact is regenerative, and that we both know that that's not the case. And it's this deeper. How do we keep people humble enough to understand that also? Yes, I completely agree with everything you said around the UN system and talking to everyone. And even if we see that these systems are deeply flawed, we still need to engage. We need to engage with the WEF, lots of well-meaning people there. And again, so wedded to the growth imperative, even if they speak about we need to reinvent capitalism, it's hard for them to really truly re-perceive, because they're not slowing down enough, sitting with silence enough to actually re-perceive the adjacent possible. And that's where I feel also where the importance of the bioregional work is, that we have two ways of reducing the converging problem cluster, wicked problem, whatever people like to call it, when they use it under a problem framing. Climate change, inequality, resource depletion, global migration caused by that, war, power blocks. you name it, social cohesion going out of the window with more and more fissioning of societies into very polarized patterns. All of that, you can either take the route into abstraction and get the scientists and the sociologists and everybody in to huddle around this problem, define the problem ever more detailed with ever more research and data, maybe even get some AI to do some work on all that data. But it's in the abstract space. And then you get the designers and engineers in, and then you design solutions, and then you force them out to the world. The reason why I think the bioregional approach is not just saying you need to pay attention to the scale, but is a different way of working, is because it says the other way of reducing this complexity that we can't handle. Since we tried at least 20, 25 years, some of us, to find the solutions and to talk it through as problems and to find the finance for the solutions. Look at the COP process that we mentioned a few times. It's exactly that process. And they're all well-meaning people. And it was necessary, and it still is necessary. I'm not saying it isn't. But the bioregional counterpart to this is to say the other way of reducing this complexity and facing the mess, turning into the skid of what we've created, is to say we're a bioregional ecosystems-based species. No matter what we do on internationally, we need to model it and live it in our bioregion. And the difference between the kind of going back to live on the countryside and eco-village, I spent a long time in the eco-village movement, and the difference of that impulse in the 1970s is that that was a bunch of somewhat aligned, if often only in their critique of the mainstream rather than in where to go, somehow aligned people creating intentional communities to say we can live differently in this little sandbox, in this little place apart from the other. Bioregionalism doesn't allow that luxury to be selective with who you have to talk to. Bioregionalism is the messy scale at which you cannot other the people on the other spectrum of the political arena. You cannot other the people who made the mess locally, who created the Superfund sites in your region. You cannot other the politicians, nor the business people, nor the NGOs who are very often stopping environmental development by saying, not in my backyard, or windmills are ugly, we want the rolling countryside of Devon. So it's when you work with that bioregional scale that you begin to reduce the complexity, not by ignoring any of these problems we just mentioned. They all show up in every place on the planet in different varieties, but they show up with peoples who have a face and who have a story and who have a deep connection to place. And because of that, that's where you can meet them. You can see we're all living here, and you can meet them with their children's future in that place and their own relationship to that place. And suddenly you can, it's not easy. And every time, even here locally, I steer my effort into working with the local system, I very quickly want to pull back and say, what a headache. Lots of voluntary work, badly paid, and people start fighting, and you want to bring people together and it's not working out. And all of that will show up too, but it shows up in a specific way. And that's why I think it's a both and. And the danger, by just to tie both to this, the danger of saying, okay, great that these big players are now talking. If they're talking at the wrong scale and they're still trying to build these, like, of course we need global trade, and we need to make this vision work. We need to be deeply globally collaborative, bioregion to bioregion, to enable people in the less fortunate parts of the world that have been hit twice by colonialism and neocolonialism in the form of economic globalization. They need supporting in finding their ways to regenerate their bioregions. But it needs to come out of the story of place and the people in place. And if the large players redesign their problem solving in the support of the local and the bioregional, then I think we do still have opportunities to create a way through this eye of the needle that we're facing. Yeah, I mean, this is precisely we can't have regenerative bioregions in a globally degenerative system, but we can begin to build the new at the bioregional scale as we also, or others, and we value the work of others doing that global work. So that's what I think also where Laura was going, is saying this is not an either or, and you're not fundamentally wrong if you're not moving to Colombia and starting a bioregional project somewhere in a sandbox that is far away where things are more easy. No, you have to face your bioregion and start with whether it's greater Los Angeles. Look at the life of Andy Lipkis and tree people. For 40, 50 years, this man has stuck where he was, built an NGO, and basically slowly changed the watershed management of the greater LA region to be with the fundamental vision of bringing the salmon back into the LA River. That's like facing the dragon head on and standing your ground to some extent. And that's what we need in so many ways. Like the people, I know so many people who have worked their entire life within the UN system, and the UN system has done so much damage, and at the same time it is the system where we can have a global conversation, and we need so desperately that system. So yeah, anyway, so the challenges around bioregionalism is how do we bring the bigger players into understanding, and they're beginning to, like the buzzword now is decentralized manufacturing. The large players have understood the fragility of supply chains. They're beginning to see that the circular economy that we've been talking around so long actually has a deep root in industrial ecology and cradle to cradle thinking, which were the first two iterations of this way of thinking. And if you go back to the roots of this thing, industrial ecology, it's highly localized and only really makes sense if we create eco-industrial parks that provide for bioregions rather than create continental scale cyclical patterns of materials, because the energy of shifting the materials at that scale is just not justified. So, and it creates much more redundancy in a brittle world, brittle for climate and all sorts of other disasters, to have multiple manufacturing capacities all over the globe rather than one centralized manufacturing capacity in one place. And that's precisely where the danger would be, that some of us just become bioregionalists and try to do the kind of ultra local zero kilometer thing, and others keep driving the global system. We need to make these two meet. Like I have done consultancy with large international corporations and invited them into reinventing themselves as a global network of bioregionally focused businesses that share innovation and what is needed to enable the bioregional work globally, but actually more and more shift towards providing over the long term what the bioregion that they're in needs, and building the local regenerative enterprise ecosystem and being part of it, ultimately to the point of changing ownership models and business models to more cooperative models, to more shared models, and ownership to more intergenerational land trusts and all of that. All that transformation is possible. And what we need precisely is people who focus deeply on the regional and people who focus on how do we build the systems that integrate scale linking the local, regional, national, and global in a way that they don't compete, but actually let life flow the way that life works, because that nested wholeness or cellular nested structure is how life functions. And that's what we need to recreate in our economic system. Anyway, Laura.
Yes, I completely agree with all of that. And I think part of the role that I see myself and others playing in the intersection between regeneration and business is to how can we initiate a conversation around how do we revitalize, regenerate the bioregions upon which we affect, because many corporations are not just operating on a local one place based way of operating, but has factories in many places. So the companies that I have worked with has embarked on a very interesting journey of, okay, so we have factories in Vietnam, Portugal, and Germany. What is our local connections here? How can we help infuse a new regenerative way of being into these local communities? But also, how can we start to initiate a conversation among our customers as to how they can become local ambassadors for regeneration where they are? And I'm mentioning this just as an example of the fact that and I know you agree, but we don't all have to start working in a bioregional kind of way, the way Joe Brewer is, for example. Although he does amazing work, there are various ways as to where employees and business executives can start to work in a way where they are rooted their essence in a bioregional way, and where they are starting to disrupt how they do business and the old business models and the old organizational design models, in a way where they are seeing how can they in a local scale become this regenerative force for good, and how can they help restore and revitalize that particular region. And then it becomes very practical. That becomes holding space for difficult conversations with a factory in Portugal that has had a long family tradition of this way of producing clothes or shoes, and now you are telling us that you only want to continue to invest in us if we start a regenerative journey, where we are also contemplating the kind of workers we bring in and how can we play a social role here, how can we educate people in new ways of being, how do we source materials in a way where we are also empowering new business model through that, and that is just in the beginning, it's a headache for so many people, because suddenly you start to open up Pandora's box, because every time you think you've reached the final destination, that destination has another set of interconnected, internested trains or threads, right? Because you can constantly kind of go further and further out. But that's also the fascinating journey, and more business leaders are starting to get excited about that journey. How can I? The great example is, of course, Interface, who are starting to map. Okay, how can we, for example, pay Philippine fishermen to fish up discarded plastic net from our oceans and make that part of our production chain in a closed loop model that we then sell as a service. All those kind of things is part of that journey. And to me, I'm excited about communicating that perspective to business leaders, that they can become bioregional champions, not just in their own local region, but they can help hold safe spaces for initiating those kind of discussions in all parts of the world where their company have kind of keynote points of interventions. And then I would also say, what we talked about yesterday in the John Fullerton session that I was reminded by what you said just now was, I sent people out into discussion groups with the inspiration from Ilya Prigogine, the quantum physicist and Nobel laureate, who, among many brilliant things, have said that small islands of coherence in a sea of chaos have the capacity to what I have lost the have the capacity to shift the entire system into a higher order. And to me, that quote is inspiring, because it speaks to the fact that we are all change agent, regardless of our position, regardless of the platform, regardless of the people that we reach. We can all offer that sea of coherence, or that island of coherence, rather, in a sea of chaos. And how can we bring regeneration? It can be very complex to start a journey in understanding the interconnectedness and the vocabularium of living systems thinking, which can often become very academic. But to everyone that are part of the session today, I would like to encourage everyone to see themselves as regenerative change agents in their circle of influence. And how can they start to align with life regardless of where they are? How can they start to become curious as to what that would look like and taste like and feel like, to start to become conscious of the fact that we are all ripple creators, and what would life do in every interaction you come across as you navigate your day.
Yeah, for me that's a huge question, because I if I have to be self-aware in where I am on the spectrum of pro or contra technology and stuff, I have a little bit of a Luddite tendency. I'm a bit cautious with technology, and at the same time, we wouldn't be talking in this magical way with people from I don't know how many different countries spanning the globe at the moment if we didn't have amazing technology at our command, and also all the learning that I've done probably wouldn't have been possible, and many of us, without technology. And so how do we, this is exactly, it's very related to the question we had earlier. How do we work with the large corporates and celebrate that they're jumping onto the regenerative, this, that, and the other? And I can see how in the crypto space and in the tech space, lots of people have picked up memes from the regenerative conversation and that has influenced even how they model the technological developments, like the wonderful people in the Holochain group and the Commons engine and all of that, people working on green cryptocurrencies, seeds, for example, or the Regen network trying to use tech to enable farmers to be paid twice for both their produce and for the regenerative custodianship of the land that they're farming. All of that is powerful. And also this vision of a multi-level redundancy and resilience building, scale-linked society that enables communities at local and regional and national scale to have a high level of self-reliance, but in an interdependent and collaborative way with other places all around the world. How do we build that, and how do we nuance what technologies we need to use when is vital to this building a regenerative future. The thing is that as soon as we bring the technologists into the room, there's so much money concentrated, there's so much brain power concentrated, there's so much 50 years of self-corroborating narrative of we're just getting better and better and more powerful, and we're getting richer and richer, and all of that. Yeah? That people are starting to even believe the transhumanist story, that we are only here to enable the next stage of evolution into silica-based life forms, microchips that have remnants of somebody's consciousness somehow downloaded onto them and implanting that into robotics. And people actually get excited about this. They don't think that this is complete and utter dystopian sci-fi. And so how, I don't really have an answer, but my conviction is that we need to engage the tech people, but we need to dethrone the self-fulfilling prophecies that a lot of these people repeat day in, day out. People really well-meaning, like brilliant people, Daniel Schmachtenberger, he sees the danger of exponential tech, but as far as I understood last time I talked to him, which is far too long ago, and I'd love to do it again, his verdict on it was like, we can't stop it, so we have to somehow dance with it. And that for me is what Goethe spoke to 200 years ago when he wrote The Wizard Apprentice and when he wrote Faust. And it's in the Torah with the golem. It's running throughout life, that there is something like, watch out what magic you conjure up, because that magic can become your master. It's really like, or Arthur C. Clarke's, any sufficiently advanced technology is undistinguishable from magic. those have a lot of wisdom to it, but we are not mature enough to be powerful magicians at this point. And how do we rein in those tools and make them serve life rather than a few individuals? Yeah, questions rather than answers. Laura, what do you think?
No, I very much resonate with all of what you said, and I think I'm slightly in the same camp of being a bit skeptical. I was visiting Singularity University 4 or 5 years ago, and I just remember the horror and the shock of sitting there and having one speaker after the other, only males, talking in kind of incredibly high beta way of their fascination about we're only a few years away from the first fetus potentially being born by a robot and all those kind of things, which is incredibly scary to me. But how amazing it would be if we had the level of consciousness to be given this powerful weapon, if we could transform it into being infused with the intelligence of life, and natural intelligence rather than, yeah.
Maybe this is the deep difference between the solutioneering of the tech industry, even if it is trying to aim the power of tech towards good, and do deeply regenerative work. And it also runs through the design world. Like I did my PhD in the design faculty, and designers are taught to be very object focused or brief outcome focused. And in this business world, you have to deliver the deliverable at some point, and it tends to be an object, or a new technology, or a new production mechanism, or a new transport system. But it's a physical manifestation. And really what working regeneratively in a place-sourced and culture-sourced way in place means is that we still do exactly the same thing, but we do it in terms of bringing structures into the world and running safe to fail experiments. But we see everything we bring into the world as a prototype, and we hold it lightly because we know that there will be unforeseen consequences. And that's another argument for relocalization and re-regionalization, because if we make these mistakes at scales where feedback is fast, where we do it within context and we see how it destroys context or benefits context, then we can understand whether it's a good or not a good technology. So it's really that's one thing. And the other bit about reframing these technological innovation processes in a regenerative way is to do what exactly you were describing, to focus much more on, as we as technologists try to serve these people in this place in ways that are appropriate to the ecosystem and the culture, we are actually engaging in a collective learning process that touches everyone in our business team, everyone who will be our future customer, every community where our ideas will be implemented, all the way up the supply ecosystem and all the way down into the circular repurposing of these materials. And what we're actually doing and focusing our attention on when we work regeneratively is the opportunity of somebody funding a big infrastructure project and a dam being built or a bridge being built is an opportunity for learning for the entire community that this infrastructure touches. And then an infrastructure can be regenerative. Even if after 20 years we say we shouldn't have built that dam, we've still built the capacity for people to question the dam that 20 years later they said we shouldn't have built that dam. And that's a very, very different way of working with technology and design, focusing on the capacity and capability building in the process of the capacity to journey into an uncertain future, rather than to be object and outcome focused and solutioneering. Oh, now it worked. It worked from last year to this year, so therefore it must work forever, and therefore we can export it to everywhere. That's the arrogance of the technological mindset.
If I can just quickly add to that, I know we're coming to an end, but That is exactly also what I encourage everyone to do, is to map the ecosystem of every interaction, every material, every employee, and start to see the fascinating tapestry of life. And that is such a powerful exercise that you can all do today, that I have run with organizations over and over again. And it's like it's opening a new door for so many people. Instead of seeing a value chain analysis as a very linear thing, start to map the interconnectedness of life and start to then see, okay, so what happens when a big part of our organization is really burned out, and let's start to see how that is actually creating really degenerative ripples. Or what happens when we invest in that kind of material? What kind of ripple effects is that then creating? And it starts to allow people to see themselves as these ecosystem nurturers. And how can I dance with the interconnectedness of life that my organization, that my life is nested within? So that's part of the kind of retraining and then reclaiming old ways of being, and old ways of being these custodians of life that we can incorporate into every process. Because as you say, Daniel, it's all about capacity building right now. It's all about creating or addressing things in a new regenerative way, and allowing the process to be the product and the outcome in many ways. It's not a 10-step model. It's not a checklist that you can check off and off you go. It's about surrendering to the fact that we need time for integration. We need space. We need time spent in nature. It's not a quick fix. And that is, I think, a shared thing that Daniel and I feel against McKinsey's taking over the regenerative meme. Although it's part of every kind of process, it is the sadness that I think we both feel, that it's transformed into a quick fix and a new fancy business model and a new 10-step role framework that you could be certified in. And that's not it. It's a process. That's also why my course is a year-long process, because it takes time, and it's not done within a year. It's an unfolding process where we are shedding layers, and we are becoming truer and truer to our essence, to our quintessence, to our radical truth. And from there, we can start to see more and more nuances and more layers, that it's not just about a fancy new word for sustainability. It's so deep, and it's unfolding for me on a daily basis, and I assume it's the same for Daniel, and we will never know everything there is to know. But instead of being overwhelmed and confused and frustrated by that, see it as a fascinating journey of coming back to life, of coming back home, and allowing the joy and the freedom that is associated with embarking on a journey that is taking you back to a life-centered approach to life.
Well, there's so much to respond to that, but it kind of also reminded me to something that I wanted to say in wrapping up, which is related, is like Laura early used the word army and caught herself saying bad metaphor, and I feel like the mycelium metaphor is really powerful, and it's also, yesterday we spoke about this in the Bioregional Regeneration Summit, because the way that mycelia pervade the forest, to the point that if you were to take all the cellulose away, you'd still see both above ground the shape of the trees and below ground the entire shape of the forest as a sort of ghostly white mycelial network that connects everything. And it's really, how do we become mycelia? How do we enter into every branch of the human webwork on the planet and transform it from within? And how do we become aware that we can only do that if we're constantly checking in with ourselves? How do we need to transform ourselves to be of service to the larger context? It's this paradoxical understanding that it's not surrendering individualism to the collective, like maybe the Chinese model is trying to preach to people. It's finding individualism in our capacity to be of service to the larger context that brought us forth, our communities, the ecosystem, the living planetary biosphere. And there are hundreds, like Rumi said, there are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. In a similar way, I think there are hundreds of ways to get out of the way and experience life's regenerative impulse flow through us. And I think this is the most important message of this whole awakening, is that it is life flowing through us. And all we need to do individually and collectively is to relearn the capacity to listen and act in accordance to what Jung called the 4 ways of knowing. If we reactivate our other 3 ways of knowing, sensing, feeling, and intuiting, and we temper it with what we've been focused on for far too long exclusively, which is the mind, thinking, then we can not just produce knowledge, but act out of wisdom. And that's the need for community there is crucial. So we need to build community in our business, in our local community, in our bioregion, of other people who are also on that journey humbly. And yeah, I mean, I guess the best advice in all of this is be very careful for anybody who is presented as a regenerative expert and tries to tell you from that role of expert how to do this, because it's actually deeply within us, and it's much more important to find that regenerative impulse in all of us than it is to learn by heart the key memes that the guru preaches, no matter who the guru is or how he presents himself.